Good morning. It is Wednesday morning. That means Garland Nixon and Scott Ritter here. Plenty to say. Let's talk. Good morning. I just looked in the comments and somebody put Garland is one of those rare Americans you can't label an asshole never. And I thought about that country song that I love. Were you born an asshole or did you work on it all your life? All right. So that being said, we got the comedy side apart, as weak as that may be. We got this comedy side done. Garland Nixon, Scott Ritter here. Don't forget, you can go to scottritterextra.com, scottritterextra.com for all of Scott's good work. He writes a lot of articles. He does a lot of good stuff. So scottritterextra.com. All right, Scott, let us chat. You wrote an article recently, and basically the foundation of it was the deal is done. The fate is sealed for Ukraine. What's the gist of that? Because here's what we hear: they want a frozen conflict. Oh yeah, the Russians are going to buy into that, right? They've had a frozen conflict since 1945. So the frozen conflicts we're hearing, the Ukrainians are going to, they're never going to. This is the thing: they're never going to negotiate with the Russians until such time as the Russians are, lying on their ground begging for mercy, things of that nature. But Scott Ritter says, their fate is sealed. What do you mean by that, Scott Ritter?
Well, I mean, if we go back in time and look at Imperial Japan, and we look at the Battle of Iwo Jima in early 1945. Nobody was talking at that point in time about a negotiated peace with Japan. Japan, was saying, "We're going to fight you on the beach. We're going to fight you here. We're going to fight you there, everywhere." Ultimately, Japan ended up sending a delegation to USS Missouri, parked in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, where they signed, terms of their surrender. They were unconditional. Japan didn't get a vote. The war was over. That's Ukraine's fate. The chance for a negotiated settlement has passed. Ukraine had negotiated a settlement back in March of 2022, a settlement that their negotiators had signed off on, one which, by the way, in retrospect, looked like pretty good terms. But, they would have kept Kherson, Zaporizhia. The Donbass would have been independent, but in need of a referendum to decide which way to go. 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers would be alive today. $1 trillion worth of infrastructure would not have been destroyed. Tens of millions of people would not have been displaced. But nope, they caved into, Boris Johnson and NATO's insistence that they keep the fight going, and so they did, and now they're paying the price. The price is that Russia will end this conflict at a time and place and under conditions that Russia alone is going to decide. Russia will not be yielding anything to Ukraine or the collective West. We've seen in the lead up to this stories about how the collective West is meeting and talking about, what terms they would be able to offer Russia. Russia ain't in the business of receiving terms from anyone. Russia's made clear what its objectives are, and when the West and Ukraine are ready to sit down and say, okay, we're going to work with that, I think they'll find that the Russian terms will continue to be very fair, but there will be Russian terms set by Russia, derived from a Russian military victory that is ongoing, taking place, and there's not going to be a reversal. For anybody hoping for a frozen conflict to have this thing dragged out, I think battlefield realities are dictating a different outcome.
Yeah, and I think, both of us from the very beginning, you looked at it and you said, this is a lopsided matchup. Can they drag it out for a while? Yeah, they can probably drag it out for a while. Yes, but the matchup was lopsided from the very beginning. When I see one nation that is basically a military superpower and the other is being propped up by other countries, you looked at it from the beginning. You tell me, do you see it differently? I thought it would be quicker for this reason. I thought that Russia would expend a lot more power to stomp Ukraine into the ground. In my review of this, I think that Russia could have done a lot more. They held off a lot because they didn't want to crush as much infrastructure and kill as many civilians, I think. I also think that because this is war is a broad spectrum conflict. They had diplomatic things that they were doing with other countries. They had allies they were trying to hold together, and if they blast a bunch of cities, they may lose. You know what I mean? There were a lot of other factors. So I don't think that it was Russia that they couldn't have caused a lot more damage a lot quicker. But I think strategically and morally, they made a decision of what they want to do. What do you think of that, Scott?
No, first of all, we know that that's the case. We know that Russia was pushing for an early negotiated end to this conflict. We know that Russia, up until the very end, was seeking a negotiated end to this conflict. You know, Ukraine has acknowledged that they were in discussions with Russia up until the decision to send troops across the border on February 24th, that Russia was trying to avoid this conflict at all costs. And even once the conflict began, it appears that the Russian strategy was to hit the Ukrainians with sort of a shock and awe campaign, more shock, less awe, meaning that they weren't seeking to destroy everything. It was just basically, hey, overwhelming military power. The outlet is right here at the negotiating table. And less than a week after the Russian offensive began, Ukraine was sending a delegation to Gomel in Belarus to begin this negotiating process. 3 consecutive negotiations in Gomel, followed by another meeting, this time brokered by the Turks in Turkey, that could have led to a final culminating meeting on 1 April in Istanbul that would have brought an end to the conflict. I mean, Vladimir Putin has shown the world the initial documents. They had a final agreed text that all it needed was the official signatures. But Boris Johnson and NATO said, no, you can't do that. You have to continue the war. One thing, there's a couple things. Look, I'm one of the people that early on said this war should be over in a week. There's no reason for this war to last more than a week. And I was somewhat taken aback by Russia's soft approach. I felt that Russia could very easily have surrounded Ukrainian troops, slaughtered them all, come in with heavy air power, taken out infrastructure, shaped the battlefield more effectively for the sole purpose of killing Ukrainian soldiers. And had they done that, I think they would have annihilated the Ukrainian army. But instead, Russia was going for that shock aspect, which means that they punched in further and faster than maybe you would do without supporting violence. They were seeking to take as much territory as possible. And it appears that they were doing that based upon intelligence that suggested that many Ukrainian generals were going to take a sidestep. They're going to say, okay, come in, we're not going to resist. Many mayors and governors were also going to let the Russians go through. And we saw that in certain areas, in Kherson and Zaporizhia in the south, where you have extensive pro-Russian elements. That was the case. Even in Kharkov and Sumy, the Russians made rapid advances. But it also appears that the Ukrainian intelligence, maybe backed up by the West, was on to what the Russians were trying to do in terms of their pre-game. And many of the people that told the Russians 2 thumbs up were actually saying 2 thumbs down, and the Russians fell into ambushes. And because these troops weren't advancing in normal combat formation, they were basically admin moves to go as fast as they can up the middle. A lot of these forward leaning forces they suffered very heavy casualties as a result. It was a very bloody defeat for many of these Russian things. But the strategic objective was achieved. Understand that the Russian goal was to get the Ukrainians to the negotiating table, and they did. It's just the Ukrainians failed to seal the deal because they bought into the NATO analysis, which was, holy cow, we thought Kiev was going to fall in 72 hours. Instead, you guys have taken out a column here and a column there and a column here, not understanding why they took them out, what the circumstances are. They misinterpreted the results as the Russians aren't that good, the Ukrainians are really good, and all we have to do is pour billions of dollars into Ukraine and we can beat the Russians. And that was their goal. Now, I think the other thing that people like myself had to wake up to was that the Russian army had a lot of problems that we may have papered over analytically, that we may have been giving the Russians far more credit, not far more, but more credit in terms of actual capability. The Russian army had grown a lot. We had seen the Russian army perform rather poorly in Georgia in 2008. And we know that the Russian army sought to rebuild itself after that and had succeeded. In 2016, they had the much ballyhooed resurrection of Soviet-era combined arms army, the 1st Guards Tank Army, the 20th Combined Arms Army, formations that had previously been based in East Germany, ready to lead the attack into NATO, were brought up with that same offensive mindset. And for people like me watching that, I'm going, 1st Guards Tank Army. That's a serious force. And so when I saw the 1st Guards Tank Army deploy against the Ukrainians, I'm thinking they're going to be moving forward. Well, it turns out that the 1st Guards Tank Army, existed basically to support parades in Moscow. And that rather than being the elite strike force that people like myself thought it was composed of guys who signed a contract so they could wear nice uniforms, go to Moscow, meet the girls, and have a fun, happy military life, free of the realities of war. And these parade soldiers were taken in, and they did not perform properly. They did not perform well. Some of them did, but I mean, rather than being this elite armored striking fist, it turned out to be sort of a more slower moving, somewhat incompetent force. And we saw that in other areas as the Russians pulled military formations out that had been building up, looked good on paper, but hadn't been doing the work, and they got in there and it just wasn't as efficient. But the one thing I'll say about the Russians is they learned from their mistakes, and they didn't sit there and cry. They licked their wounds. They rebuilt. They reorganized. They fired incompetent officers. They put new officers in, and they kept pushing. And the Russian army today is a completely different army today than the one that started the conflict. The other thing we have to point out back then is insufficient resources. Even if the Russian army had been everything that I had thought they would be when the war started, you can only do so much with limited troops. Ukraine is a huge battlefield. And to come in with 200,000 troops and think that you're going to execute, meaningful military operations on the battlefield that the Russians had defined was irrational. You're just looking at the terrain saying, they don't have enough troops to do this. They had enough troops to shock and awe. It almost worked. But when they had to go back and do the fighting, one of the reasons why the Russians withdrew from Kiev and Sumy is they need to bring those troops back to help solidify the line. And even then it wasn't enough. That's why $45 billion and 60,000 trained troops later, the Ukrainians were able to take that counteroffensive that recaptured the Kharkov Oblast, took the right bank of Kherson, pushed the Russians back. But so I guess that's a long way of saying that I can't say with 100% certainty that Russia would have been able to overrun the Ukrainian forces. I originally thought they would have. I think in order for them to do that, they would need more troops, because to do it with the troops that they had, it turned out that some of those units weren't as good as everybody thought they would be. And this led to give you an example, one of the units that underperformed was the 58th Combined Arms Army, in particular the 42nd Guards Motorized Rifle Division. It came in and it got its nose bloodied on a number of occasions. One of the regiments lost their regimental commander, lost a deputy, lost some officers. And their morale was sort of shaken, not broken, shaken. And these units received a lot of mobilized soldiers to bring their numbers back up to speed. And they were sent to a so-called quiet sector of the front, a sleepy little village called Robotino on the Zaporizhia front, where the 291st Regiment, the 75th Regiment created defensive positions. They were backed up by the 71st Regiment, some Marines, some Special Forces, in this quiet sector, licking their wounds. And NATO took a look at that and said, wow, we got the 291st and the 70th side by side at Robotino. These guys didn't do so well last spring. They're full of mobilized guys, which we like to believe aren't motivated, aren't trained, going to run. they're going to run at the first gunshot. It's like that old, the Battle of New Orleans. We fired our gun, the British kept it coming. We fired once more, and they began running. So I think they honestly thought this was going to happen. So they designed the attack on the seam of 291st and 70th. They came in and they found a completely different Russian army. And the best way to describe the current Russian army is to talk about the Alyosha tank incident. You saw the video of the mad kamikaze tank going in against the two T-72s and the 6 infantry fighting vehicles, one tank against 8, and they beat them all. And these guys all got decorated as heroes of Russia, and they deserve it. Nobody's putting it down, but sort of this big legendary thing. But look at the crew of the tank. The crew is composed of a contract officer, a volunteer, and 2 mobilized troops. So it's a mix of all the things that go on there. The contract officers, the West say, are just guys who signed a contract. They really don't want to fight. The volunteers, enthusiastic but poorly trained and untested. The mobilized guys don't want to be there, rather be home. This crew kicked some serious butt. And I would say that while that particular incident is sort of unique, not everybody gets to be a 1-on-8 superhero. I would say that there's nothing extraordinary about these troops. I mean, they're not handpicked elite troops. These guys are the salt of the earth. They're what the Russian army is. And I would say that there's a whole bunch of Aloshas out there. That's what the Ukrainian army is running up against. This is a completely different army composed of people that are very good at their job, very motivated, very brave, and dedicated to the task of defeating the Ukrainian army on the battlefield.
Yeah, I think that interestingly enough, what this conflict did was it took, and let's face it, it's like anything else. We can, you played sports, you played football, I played basketball. You can do all the drills you want to, but until you get in the game, it ain't the same. The speed's different. People are coming at you, reaching at you. Pad, you got to be crisp. You got to think of 10 things that you can't even think when you're playing the game. You can't think. If you think you're going to make mistakes, you got to just play, right?
You're going to get hit.
One thing, exactly. It's one thing to train for battle. It's one thing to train for the game, but nothing hones your skills like being in the game. So for all of the plans of the Russian army, they had the battalion tactical groups, all this thing. They've reorganized. Totally. For a major battle. They've done so many things, but in my opinion, they couldn't possibly have done these things unless they were engaged in battle to see how the things they were doing worked. So what this conflict has done, and I'm not saying that this is a positive thing, this is just a reality. What the conflict has done is created an environment for the Russian army to hone its skills, both in a micro perspective, the individual soldiers using a tank and blah, 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 and the macro perspective from the Russian leadership getting rid of people who didn't do the job, adding people, moving things around till they could make it more effective. It made the Russian army what it really wanted to be, which was a really good army. And not to mention adding the technology. They couldn't know what they needed for drones until they started using them, when they started seeing what was effective, when they started talking to other countries, hey, can we get some of these? And then, oh, we'll make some changes. So you created this giant conflict, created a much better Russian military than they had before, an effective fighting force. Your thoughts? Probably now, let's face it, there haven't been battles this big since, many World War II, some of them. You created the most experienced of the superpowers ground war force. Scott.
Yeah, look, first of all, let's talk about the West real briefly here. The American military considers itself, of course, to be the finest fighting force the world has ever seen. And having been a member of the finest fighting force the world has ever seen, the United States Marine Corps, I can tell you that we truly believe that we are. But when I was in, we trained 24/7, constantly for combined arms warfare. That's our bread and butter. Large scale ground combat was what we were meant to do. But after 9/11, the U.S. military got a different focus. It became low intensity conflict, counterinsurgency warfare, and every aspect of military, from recruitment to procurement to training to redefining doctrine, was focused on prevailing in that. The last thing we were thinking about collectively as a military was large-scale ground combat in Europe. And you would know, you know this too. If you're not training for it, you ain't going to perform for it on the battlefield or on the playing ground. I mean, and today the United States Army simply cannot fight the war. Don't take my word for it. General Cavoli, Christopher Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces in Europe, has said straight up in a defense forum in Sweden, Sweden or Finland, I think Sweden, in January. He said that NATO couldn't imagine the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine. He said this in January. This is pre-Bakhmut. This is pre-Robotino. This is in January when he said the scope and scale of the violence is beyond the imagination of NATO. Now, that's a pretty important thing to say because in the military, you prepare for what you imagine. What do you think a contingency plan is? A contingency plan is I imagine what a potential scenario is, and therefore I build the force structure. I train in accordance to accomplish a mission to meet those challenges. I have to imagine the mission, but if I haven't imagined it, if it's beyond my imagination, I'm not ready for it. I'm not prepared for it. That's the United States Army. The United States Army can't do this. Now, let's go to the Russians for a second. You know, they had had extensive experience in Chechnya, doing low-intensity conflict. They had limited experience with Georgia, but they didn't perform too well. So they are in the business of trying to reshape their military doctrinally, etc. But that's basically like saying that I'm going to build my plan for the season based upon some scrimmages with lower level teams and what I see on the training field. I don't know how my team performs in the game yet, using your sports analogy. But the Russians have come in and they did imagine this fight. But you brought up drone warfare. It's fascinating. The Russians admitted today that everything they thought about what drone warfare would look like in a modern large-scale ground conflict was wrong. That drone warfare, what they were ready to do, didn't meet the demands of the new battlefield. The Russians and the Ukrainians, and we have to give the Ukrainians a little bit of props here because, they're helped extensively, but what's happening on the battlefield right now in terms of drone warfare is beyond the imagination of anybody in the West. We couldn't imagine this. What they're doing right now is mind-blowing. We tried to create a family of kamikaze drones, the switchblades, small warheads, insufficient range. What we're finding out is everything we thought would be needed for this weapon is wrong. The Russians and the Ukrainians, meanwhile, are engaged in very intensive drone wars going on, very bloody stuff. They're killing a lot of people, killing a lot of equipment, completely revamped. If the Russians go to war against NATO-style force, the Russians are going to dominate in the drone battle alone. But the Russians have also, as you indicated, the battalion tactical group that they came in with was meant to be the response to the brigade combined arms team of the United States Army, basically small combined arms maneuver forces that were envisioned on doing things. Turns out that doesn't work on a modern battlefield. They sort of get taken off the battlefield. So the Russians have just reconfigured the way they're going forward right now in terms of the design. They're going back to sort of a hybrid of what used to be under Soviet times, combined with the battalion tactical group, combined with just the realities of dealing with the Ukrainians in the current tactical situation. But they have redone their military, and let me put it this way: we're not ready for whatever they've done because we're still doctrinally training to fight a battalion tactical group. That's how we organize. If you go to the various training facilities in the United States, when they talk about the opposition forces, even if they're being honest and saying this is a Russian-style force, they're fighting battalion tactical groups. So we're thinking about old-style warfare. We will have no clue what's hitting us. Electronic warfare was always a big deal. It's a bigger deal right now. I think there's some of these mercenaries that are coming back from the front are saying, we can't communicate, we can't see, we can't do anything because they're jamming the hell out of everything. We gave them the JDAM bomb. If anybody who was a JTAC or a forward air controller in Iraq or Afghanistan, they're in love with the JDAM. J is it's a satellite-guided bomb. So basically, you're out there, you plug in your satellite coordinates, send it up to the plane, they put it in the bomb, they drop it, and the bomb glides down and hits right where you tell it to hit. That's really cool in Afghanistan and Iraq, where there's no air defense and there's no jamming, and you have a bunch of villagers or a wedding party or whatever it is you're bombing for that day, and you hit it with the JDAM. Boom, yay! The JDAMs are being jammed. They're being dropped, and they're just not going where they want. And the different ways they jam, it's not just breaking the signal, making it go dumb. They're putting in new signals. They're breaking into our encrypted systems, reconfiguring the bomb so it goes elsewhere. Also, the other thing is Russian air defense is tracking these bombs when they're released, and they're shooting them down. So these bombs are coming in, and air defense is shooting them down. They're shooting down the HIMARS. They're shooting down everything. The Russians have been learning about how the West fights wars, and they are adapting. Meanwhile, the Russians have taken, their dumb bombs, and they've adapted them. Fab 250, the Fab 500 were dumb, stupid bombs. What I mean by that is you essentially just drop them. So the Russians would come in with their avionic, their avionics that would have them come in. They program in a target, and it tells them when to pitch up. It tells them when to release the bomb. Then they peel away, and the bomb sort of glides in dumb. Now the Russians are back here, and they'll drop it, and its wings fold out, and it glides in in its precision. It's taking things out. I think they just put out a 750 kilogram, 1,500 pound glide bomb with satellite guidance. And if the West isn't, and the Russians are learning about how we jam, and they're defeating our jam, and they're ahead of us on this, we don't know what we in the West aren't prepared for what the Russians have done. So the Russians have reinvented warfare. Are they perfect? No, nobody's perfect. War is hell. But they're doing pretty darn good against a Ukrainian military that's received a lot of help from the West. One of the things that's unappreciated about the Ukrainians is what gives them a lot of tactical advantages is the intelligence provided by the West. The Ukrainians have near perfect intelligence. Every U.S. and NATO intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance asset that can be brought to bear on the battlefield is being brought to bear on the battlefield without interference from the Russians, because the Russians can't jam them because that's NATO. You don't want to do an act of war, etc. So they're getting this perfect intelligence, and they're able to pick the downtime. They're able to pick a seam. They're able to come in there, and the Russians are still prevailing on this. It's I think when the final story is told about these battles that are taking place, you're going to see that the Russian military today is one of the finest modern militaries in the world, better than the American Army, 10 times better than the American Army, because the American Army is like that football team that's never gone through hate drills. You bring guys back from the summer, and it's hate drills, and that's two guys, one guy with a ball, blow the whistle, bam, you hit each other just to get hits. All you're trying to do is hit each other. People, and you'd be surprised how many people forgot how much it hurts to get hit, and they quit. They just walk off and say, I don't want to do this anymore. Russia's gone through the hate drills. Russia's gone through the full contact scrimmages. Russia's midway through the season, and Russia's doing well. They are ready to play. America's the team coming off the bench and hasn't been hit yet. And you can't put that team on the field against the Russians and expect a positive outcome.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's been a lot made recently of a Challenger tank being blown up, right? So now a Challenger tank, I don't think that's as much. Look, whatever you put on the field, whatever you put on the field, some of them's going to get blown up and some of it's not. That's the nature of things. But I do think the one of the things that has come out as a result of this, I'm not going to say come out, I'll just put it like this. The West sells a lot of weapons. They sell a lot of weapons, and they say, look, you got to buy these whatever's for ultimate millions of dollars from Lockheed Martin because they're the best in the world. And they give them names: the Patriot, the Switchblade, the Challenger, the Leopard, whatever, all of these names. And these names sound really, really good. I think the spectacle of these things going to the battlefield, and as in the Patriot, what did it last, an hour? They turned it on, boom, a couple of Kinzhal missiles, it's gone. That the spectacle of these things, and I'll go a little more philosophical here, has damaged the world's view of Western weapons. What people looked at U.S. weapons, et cetera, was like, man, they got really sharp stuff. They got really good stuff. And when they see it smoking on the battlefield, I think the world's looking at it like, man, you guys' stuff is kind of old here. Doesn't look like it's up to par. So my question to you is that a realistic view that these Western weapons really aren't up to modern standards based on, what we're seeing the Russians use? Or is it that, look, you're on a battlefield, things are going to get blown up? Is there some combination of both?
Well, the problem is the West is coming off of, during the Cold War, especially in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, we were building weapon systems that were purpose designed to defeat the Soviet threat on large scale combat. And some of these weapons were pretty good. And because this was a realistic scenario, we really thought there was going to be a war, and we were training realistically. These weapons were put through their paces, and I think they were decent weapons. The Patriot missile is one of these weapon systems. It was snake fit from the beginning, though. One of the problems with the Patriot is that we were trying to adapt a technology that was linked to, Sky, I want to say Sky Guard, but basically the Nike Zeus missile defense system that we were going to protect America from ballistic missile attack. It had this computerized system that was automated. And the idea is that once the missile attack comes in, the system takes over, tracks, fires, and all this kind of stuff. And everybody loved that idea. So when the ABM Treaty made the continued development of this system, not going to happen, what they did, typical defense contractor fashion, is they said, we have this technology, let's find a use for it. And so they came up with the Patriot missile system. The Patriot missile system was always based around the idea of an autonomous air defense system that you basically just sit back and go for it, boys, and it fires off. It never really worked. We never really got the solution to it. I can tell you from the Gulf War, on January 17th, there was a Patriot battery outside of Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. They got credit for shooting down a Scud. I mean, they literally gave a guy a Bronze Star medal for shooting down the Scud. There was no Scud fired on that day, not one at all. What happened is there was a glitch in the system, and the system saw. One of the things that was happening is because the Patriot was developed, in theory, but never got practiced, never got tested out. We never tested what would happen if you have an AWACS system over here broadcasting on a certain frequency, and we were doing other jamming with other systems here, and the combination of these signals, what they do to radar signals coming back on the system, and they became a ghost in the machine saying a missile had been fired when no missile had been fired, and the Patriot tracked the non-existent thing, fired it up there, and because nothing would boom on the ground, they went, we got it, baby, we killed it. They gave them medals. Patriots sucked, couldn't do the job. They didn't shoot down a single Scud. I'm just telling you straight up. People say, well, they influenced the system. The damn missile broke up in the air into three parts. You had a warhead with a guidance system strapped on, whirling coming in. So it's like a maneuvering warhead no matter what. You ain't going to hit that. Then you got a main body that's sort of floating there, but you're tracking that, but then you hit the tail section, and the missile didn't hit anything. Well, we influenced it by blowing up in front of it. Look at the slow motion signal. The warhead gone past before the warhead blows up. You didn't influence anything. That war hit where it was going to hit no matter what. Thank God the Scud was inaccurate, but neither in Saudi Arabia or Israel did we shoot down a single Scud. And yet we told the world that Patriot was aggressive. Remember, George Herbert Walker Bush went to Raytheon and said the Patriot is a Scud killer. The Patriot saved us, kept Israel out of the war, all that kind of stuff. The Patriot didn't work. And it hasn't worked since then. It shot down our own airplanes in the second Gulf War. It couldn't defend the Aramco facilities from drone attacks coming out of Yemen. And now we have this system that we continually upgrade. But the thing about the system is never perfected the automatic mode. During the Gulf War, we had it on automatic mode, and the Iraqis were firing 3 missiles at Riyadh, and we were firing 30 missiles in response, and we were running out of missiles. So they had to go to manual mode, which means now you need a trained operator coming in there, and he's taking over, he's monitoring this stuff. And it took a certain skill set, and even then we didn't hit it. The point I'm trying to get at is the Patriot system that has been deployed to Ukraine doesn't work at all, can't work. the only chance it has to work is if you give it a really, really experienced crew that has been trained in every aspect of it, that can override the automatic features, take over when necessary to do the tasks. The Ukrainians ain't that crew. The Ukrainians got the basic sit down here, turn on here, pop, 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 and let it go automatic. And what the Russians have done is they've come in and they tickle the system. I mean, they come in with the first thing, get the radar to go off. They come in with the second missile, it fires the third. And so suddenly as the target comes in closer, the system goes into override and pickles everything. And you've seen the video as they come in.
They fired like 30 missiles at one time.
And that was it. And then boom, radar's taken out. The Patriot sucks. That's the reality. Every system we've given Ukrainians suck because they don't know how to use it. Look, ANTPQ-36 radar. Basically, it's a radar, guys, which means if it's on, it's emanating. And if it's emanating, it can be detected and taken out. So if you're going to employ the ANTPQ-36 radar in a counter battery mode, you need at least 3 of them. Why do I know this? Because I wrote the damn tactics for it back in the 80s when I got the Marine Corps to stop using ANTPQ-36 radars in a fixed position. And we had one moving, one silent, and then one performing. The one performing, we Q, turn off, silent one stand by. We had other things out there, silent one pick up, the other one's moving. You have to keep them moving on the battlefield or they die. Ukrainians, that takes a lot of training, by the way. We had to get the guys out of out of the Marine base down in Orange County, Camp Pendleton, old Camp Pendleton, up to 29 Palms. Nobody wants to go to 29 Palms, but we had to get them to 29 Palms because that's where we're doing the large-scale fire maneuver for artillery. Put them in the field all the time. When they first came out, they were so pissed off. It was like, we don't want to be here. By the end of the 3rd training evolution, about their 4th month in the desert, these guys are eating this stuff up because they're sitting there going, wow, this is how we stay alive. Because they were sort of depressed. They were like, we're going to turn it on. They're going to kill us. Now they're in there. They're doing stuff. They're moving. They're really good. The Ukrainians aren't getting that training. They're not getting training on anything. So the weapon system we're giving them aren't that good. Let's look at the Challenger tank. There was an interesting exchange that took place in England just the other day. And I can't remember the extra, but basically it was just questions about numbers of tanks. And, I forget, someone said, so we have, 200 Challenger tanks. The guy said, well, we do, but we don't, you see, because we only have, I think it was 220. We only have 178 because the rest of them have been cannibalized. They're in storage and they've been cannibalized, and they're never going to be a tank ever again because we don't build them anymore. They were cannibalized, etc. Well, so we have 178. Well, not really, because most of those are actually in storage being cannibalized as we speak. And we would have to bring them up, and we could get some of them. So we have, how many tanks? We have, 40 tanks or 50 tanks. And we gave 14 of those to the Ukrainians. Yes. What it means is all these numbers mean nothing because these are old systems. The Belgians just came out, the most honest people on the planet right now when it comes to F-16 Ukraine. Because what the Belgians said is what I've been saying all along. They said, we're not giving Ukraine any F-16s. Why? Because we bought them for our purposes, and we're going to use them until they can't be flown anymore. And when they're done, they're broken. They're old, airline fractures, nothing works. We can't give the Ukrainians that because the airplane doesn't work anymore. Netherlands, Denmark, none of them are being honest about this. So the fact is, none of these weapons work. They're all old, they're all decrepit, and there's no new stuff out there to give them.
Yeah, I think you're right. So what's the current state as you see it on the on a battlefield? There was been discussion about Robotino. Certainly, it seems to me that there's still heavy fighting going on in the area of Bakhmut, and it just seems like the same pattern to me. And here's the pattern, and they don't seem to get it in Ukraine. The West, the Ukrainians talk about, we took some hamlet, we took some burg, we took some clump of houses with a name that had 200 or 300 people. Hooray, look at that. It's in the New York Times. We've seized the town of, whatever, of Raccoonville, whatever. Okay. And then a week later, we kind of lost the town of Raccoonville, but we're going to get it back next week. And the Russians seem to be like, we knocked out X amount of soldiers, we knocked out X amount of tanks, we knocked out X amount of equipment. So there seems to be one war is we got to seize locations and tout that as some kind of a PR victory. And the other is we're going to keep knocking out their equipment. We're going to keep knocking out their capabilities. And now we're hearing that Ukraine is going to do this super mass mobilization, which to me says you ain't got nothing left. But what are you going to do with a bunch of schlubs like me with a bad back? You know what I mean? Running around here. I ain't going to, if they take me and put me on the battlefield, by the time I lift my rifle up and run 100 yards, my sciatica is going to act up and I'll be laying on the ground. They won't have to shoot me. So, and it sounds that that's the direction they're going here, for God's sake, Scott.
Yeah. Look, let's talk about Robotino for a second. As I said earlier, that was where the 291st and the 70th came together, Robotino. The Russian defenses, they call it the Surovikin line because he was the general in charge, but they're designed by other people. Surovikin had the concept, but the actual, laying down of the defenses is done by defense specialists. The guy who designed the defense in the Zaporizhia area is a lieutenant general named Alexander Romanchuk. He first was, I think he was the deputy commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army early on in this conflict, and then he was pulled out and sent to the Combined Arms Academy in Moscow. And his job was to rethink Russian defensive doctrine. The Russians had inherited a very viable defensive doctrine from the Soviets, but now he had to look at the modern battlefield, the new realities of war. What are you going to do? So he wrote a paper. It was published in March of this year that outlined this, and it's a very fascinating paper to review. I think there's an English translation that's available out there on the internet. But he talks about, basically you want 3 layers of defense, 3 lines, and the whole purpose of the defense is to shape the battlefield. So you want to get the enemy to come in. As they come in, there's a forward defensive zone that's not one of the defensive lines where you have your initial barriers, your minefields, obstacles, you're covering screening troops. And the idea there is to break up the attack and influence the direction of the attack, meaning that you want to take the enemy down position here where you have better forces to hit it. You're channeling them into fire cauldrons, fire sacks. Romanchuk designed this, and they do it by looking at a map. If you take a look at the map where Robotino is, first of all, let's remove terrain. From Robotino to the Tokmak, which is the intermediate objective of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They want to punch through Robotino, move forward, take Tokmak, and then from Tokmak, they'll bound on and take the city of Melitopol, thereby severing the land bridge between Crimea and the main Russia. That's the stated objective. Not making it up. General Zaluzhny, everybody have said this is what we want to do. The way you get through the Tokmak is through Robotino. You take Robotino, then you have to take the heights beyond Robotino, and then you work your way down and you get to Tokmak. And so the Russians basically said, we want the Ukrainians to come to Robotino. We want to come here, and then we're going to pound the living dog poop out of them. And then the idea is to compel the Ukrainians to stop attacking Robotino. You want them to shift to the north towards a village, Vorobino. I could be wrong on that. I'm sure people who are listening go, no, Scott, it's V something. It is V something. I don't know the name of it right now. But you want to shift them in that direction. Now, but the thing is, these screening operations aren't designed to be the Alamo. Robotino was never meant to be the Alamo. It was always meant to just be a screening place. They come in when the Russians don't want to commit to a decisive conflict, you fall back to your secondary prepared positions, and if need be, you fall back to the first defensive line, and if you need be, you concede the first defensive line and fall back to the second defensive line. So basically, it's designed to yield, but you want to disrupt, you want to commit as many casualties as possible. The Ukrainians committed to the Robotino battle from day one. They committed to it. And the Russians were like, well, wait a minute, they're committing, we're breaking them up. We don't necessarily have to stay here in our say, let's go back to Robotino. So they push them out, dig in, say, come on, guys. Ukrainians go, charge in again, boom, 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 push the Russians out. Then the Russians hit them with artillery, move back in. Come on, guys. And if the Ukrainians want to play that game, the Russians were going to play it all day long, and the Ukrainians were losing, horrific casualties, etc. Well, there's just nothing left of Robotino. It doesn't make sense for the Russians to go back into a village where there's no cover. The trenches have all been collapsed. The buildings are gone. There's nothing there. It's down at the bottom of the hill. So the Russians went, we're done with Robotino. They're pulling back to their prepared secondary positions on a height that dominates Robotino with fire. The Ukrainians now come in. They have no combat strength left to continue. They can't go up the hill. So what do? They look to the north where there's flat ground, and they head towards that village that begins with a V. And as they go there, they're getting hit with that because all around it's low ground. The Russians are on the heights all around it, just pounding them as they go forward. And people are like, the Iranians are advancing. The Russians are like, please come further, because the deeper they go in on this, the more they're getting hit, and the further they're getting away from their logistics and their fire support. Because in order to support that advance going in, you're going to have to bring your artillery in closer. The Ukrainians have had sort of a range advantage using some of these Caesars and the M109 Paladins, the M777s, give them a slight range advantage. So they're sort of counter battery proofed if they're there. But now you have to bring them up to support the troops going forward. And now they're getting pounded by everything. It's an unsustainable attack, and it's going exactly the way the Russians want it to go. There's some talk that some Ukrainian reconnaissance units got beyond the dragon's teeth of the first line of defense. Well, pro hint, guys, dragon's teeth aren't designed to stop light infantry reconnaissance units. They can go through anytime they want. You know what hasn't gone through the dragon teeth? A Ukrainian tank. That hasn't made it. And those light reconnaissance troops that are out there are meeting up with Russian screening forces who are destroying them and pushing them back. And the armored units that are making way towards the village are getting hit, including, oh my goodness, a Challenger tank blowing up and burning, as they all will as they come in there. This defensive battle was designed by a defensive specialist who is a master of Russian doctrine. He knows their tactics, he knows the terrain, he knows their weapon systems, and he's designed this thing, and it's performing, I can't say flawlessly, because the enemy always gets a vote. And if for a moment you start to pretend that the Ukrainians aren't dedicated, again, I get in trouble. I don't know, Garland, if you know this, but you and I had that talk about the Alosha tank a while back. Remember, you showed the video, and I was commenting on the video, giving my commentary on the video. Man, I got slaughtered by the Russians out there. Why are you defending the Ukrainians? Why are you saying this, promoting the Ukraine? I'm like, dude, I'm not defending the Ukrainians. I'm just a military guy saying it takes a level of courage to do what they're doing. I mean, I'm not saying that they're fighting for the right cause. I don't know what the ideology of these people are, but unless you've been there,
well, you know what that reminds me of, Scott? That reminds me of after 9/11 when Bill Maher got deplatformed, because they said the people who slammed into those towers were cowards. And he says, well, you can call them a lot of things, terrorists, but you can't call, basically saying any suicide bomber, anywhere, you can't call that person a coward. That was the philosophical perspective. I mean, he's just saying they ain't a coward, and they deplatformed him because he was just making a comment that was a valid comment. Hey, you might not like him. He's a terrorist. You can call him all kind of evil guys, but you can't say he's a coward. And I think all you were saying is, hey, I'm looking at the fight. These guys in here get a say. They fight pretty good too, and blah, blah, blah. And there's just a lot of people emotionally never want to hear someone say the guys that I don't like can fight pretty good too.
Well, look, there's a couple things. One, the German army, I think everybody agrees by January 1945, the Germans had lost the war. Even the Germans admit they had lost the war. And that the Russian army was superior in every way, shape, and form. Some of the bloodiest battles of the Second World War on the Eastern Front were fought from January 1945 on, because this defeated German army still had some fight left in it. And if you give them an opportunity, they will punch back. They will hurt you, and they did. The battle for Berlin was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. The capture of Prague, the campaign around Prague, cost the Russians tens of thousands of lives. So that's my whole point about the Ukrainians, is even as they're losing on the battlefield, if you don't respect the fact that these guys can't punch, and if that punch connects, it will hurt, you're in trouble. But here's the thing. In order to punch effectively, you got to have training. You got to have a lot of physical fitness. Alan, you brought up something very important. You talked about, yourself, and I'm in the same boat. No matter what you and I once were in our lives, we ain't that anymore. Okay, and I prove that every time I go on a basketball court. I think that I can do A, B, and C, and I end up doing X, Y, and Z because what's in here ain't reflective of what's going on here. But combat is a young man's game. It requires a whole bunch of endurance, a whole bunch of endurance. It requires intense training that only a young man's body can handle. And it has to be repetitive training because, as you said, once the game's on, you can't sit there and say, was it page 6 of the playbook or page 7? It's execute something now or you're going to get slaughtered. That kind of thing. And the German army during World War II was well-trained army, and a lot of those troops that were fighting in 1945 were still professional soldiers capable of executing. But as they got closer to Berlin, these well-trained troops were getting killed, captured, wounded off the battlefield. And so the Germans start mobilizing what they call the Volkssturm. And these are the young kids, these are the old men, these are the enfeebled people, people with disabilities that otherwise would have disqualified them. And the Volkssturm sucked. If you read the histories of the Battle of Berlin, when they put the Volkssturm into combat, these kids and these old men didn't know what they were doing. They got in the way of the professionals. They're just getting killed. They're creating gaps in the line. They can't, the enemy outmaneuvers them. They were actually, by employing them, you actually did more harm to the German defense than good. The Ukrainians right now are going through their Volkssturm moment. They're going down and they're starting to recruit 17, 16-year-old kids. I'm sure they're pulling some 15-year-olds off the streets. They got a 71-year-old dude in Germany right now getting trained, 71 years old.
I think I can take that guy.
They got a whole bunch
I think I could take the 71-year-old guy. That'd be about, I could deal with him.
And they got a bunch of 60-year-old guys. we fall into that category. And it's just not the thing. You can't do it at this age. You can't. And when you're young, you're just not mature enough. And these people are going to be given very rudimentary training. I mean, we're talking 21 days basic training, a couple of weeks of more sophisticated training. Then they're going to be put onto equipment that they don't know how to operate, don't know how to maintain, using tactics that are beyond their comprehension because they haven't practiced them. They're going to be thrown into battle against a Russian army that is ready for war. This is the final phase of the war. The Ukrainians are going to go through this mobilization in an effort to, create to seal the holes in the line that are being created by the bleeding down of the current Ukrainian army. And once they get slaughtered, then we get into that collapse mode that we talked about. And I think we're coming close to the collapse mode now. I think up north and near Kupiansk, we're starting to see, some fractures in Ukrainian combat cohesion up there. Once this current counteroffensive is terminated, and I mean that in the worst way of the word, and the 82nd Air Landing Brigade is taken out, and the 47th is taken out, and the 67th, the 33rd, all these elite units are all going to be dead. I think you're going to see the Russians begin that pressure, putting that pressure, advancing, and you're going to see the collapse of the Ukrainian army.
Yeah, I think you're right, Scott. I think we're looking at pretty much the end of the end of this thing coming. One last thing I'll ask you, last question. Recently, I was on a TV show, and they were brought up. They showed a videotape of Tucker Carlson saying, "I've talked to people at the highest levels, and within a year, we're going to be in a hot war with Russia." And they said, "What do you think, Garland?" I said, "I'll put it like this: if we could, we would, but we can't, so we won't." I said, in my opinion, are there hotheads up there that would do it? Yeah, there would. I think there'd be a real battle at some high levels over that, a destabilizing to this nation. I said, but in my opinion, we don't have the troops to mobilize for a ground force in Eastern Europe. At this point, we already know if you start bringing ships and aircraft carriers within 1,500 kilometers of those Kinzhal missiles, and you attack Russia, they got 10 minutes of survival time. At this point, I just don't believe that the U.S. is in a position physically, kinetically, to do that. And I added this, and I can just about, Vladimir Putin's going to be going to Moscow and Beijing. I can just about guarantee you, if the war cloud started gathering and the U.S. was like, we're going at it with Ukraine, China would surround Taiwan and say, you go after them, you're going to have to fight us both. That would be that, because China knows if you should take Russia out, which we'd all die on a nuclear problem, but if that happened, we know we're next. China would have no alternative but to join the fray, but to surround Taiwan and say, you attack Russia, you lose Taiwan immediately. And then what are you going to do? Are you going to fight us for Taiwan and attack Russia at the time? They put them in a catch-22 situation. Anyway, your thoughts on all of that, Scott?
Well, I mean, let's start. You brought up China and Taiwan. Let's start with that. I think earlier, late last year, early this year, I was very negative on prospects for peace with China over Taiwan. I was actually somebody who believed that there would be an armed conflict between the United States and China. But then something happened that nobody predicted. There was an election in November of 2022, and the Kuomintang did very well. And politically, the landscape changed. And when that political landscape changed, so did the Chinese attitudes. So suddenly, and you and I have talked about this, where you have the Kuomintang now talking about better relations. They have an election in January of 2024. If they win that election, peace will be breaking out all over. And as a result of that, and by the way, now this gets into the Tucker thing, there was a Lieutenant General, Clinton Hinote. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force responsible for strategy. And one of his jobs was wargaming. And he would wargame conflicts between the United States and China. He'd been doing that since 2019. And every time he ran a war game, we lost. We just lost. And there was an incident in the Strait of Taiwan where we went in with a Canadian ship, and the Chinese came in and almost rammed our ship to, show that freedom of passage doesn't exist here, that's China, this ain't an international waterway, you don't get to charge in here and all that stuff. And the Pingon started saying, well, what if they had hit us? What would we have done? Would we have shot them? Could we sink them? What if they hit us and did damage? Could we sink that ship? And if we sunk that ship, what would happen if the Chinese retaliated, sunk our ship? Now we have to come in, hey, Clinton Hinote, how'd that war game go? We lost. Is there any way that we won? Nope. We lost them all, everything, no matter what iteration you did, anything, we lose them all. If we start a military conflict with China, the inevitable result is we're going to lose. And on his way out before his retirement, he briefed this to the Pentagon and to the White House. And this is why Tony Blinken went to China in July, to crawl on his knees to begin a process of toning things down. Because we can't win a war against China. We can't, and the generals know that. Now let's go to Tucker Carlson. First of all, I don't know who he's talking to. I think I would agree that there is a risk of a hot war between the United States and Russia that exists in Syria. We see as the United States and NATO continues to press the red lines of Russia and Ukraine, there's a risk. But he said with certainty there's going to be a hot war. Here's the thing. In the Pentagon, there is at least one lieutenant general or general, the equivalent of Clinton Hinote, who's looking at Ukraine. And I will tell you this, there isn't a single scenario where we win a conflict against Russia. Not a single scenario. There's nothing we can do to win. Nothing. Zero. There's no chance. I mean, I'll take anybody on this one. Scott, what about NATO's Air Force? What about it? We got F-35s. That's half the problem. They're not a sustainable fighting force when you put them under pressure. But the other thing is, how many air-to-air missiles do the F-35 possess? What is the survivability rate of the E-3 AWACS aircraft as they go up? Will they be able to sustain themselves as they do right now with perfect command and control? What happens to the F-35's combat effectiveness if you take out an AWACS? Will it have to switch to satellite connectivity, that satellite that the Russians are tracking and will take down? So when that satellite goes, the AWACS goes, who's the F-35 communicating with? And suddenly, is it the miracle platform you think it is? And if they get involved in air-to-air combat, what happens when they pickle off their AMRAAMs, they pickle off their Sparrows, they pickle off their Sidewinders, and they go back to a base, assuming the base is still there, because, the Russians have the ability to take out these bases. Let's say they land. And let's say they haven't sustained any damage or the engine hasn't hiccuped, it's still able to resortie. But do they have enough air-to-air missiles? And the answer is no, we don't have enough air-to-air missiles because for the last 20 years, we haven't been preparing for this conflict. We've been producing enough air-to-air missiles for training and for a presence to win a short conflict, not to win a long conflict. That's just the Air Force, which isn't going to work because we've never trained against an integrated air defense system of the complexity and sophistication of the Russians. We don't know how to do that, and we're going to fail when we try, because we always fail when we first try something like that. That's just the Air Force, the one that everybody thinks is going to turn the tide. What about the Army? We don't have enough troops, end of story. We don't have enough tanks, end of story. We don't have the logistics. We don't have the ammunition. Look at our artillery pieces. Come on, all you guys out there, you're pretty good at Google. Go ahead and Google what a brigade combat team, a mechanized brigade combat team, how many artillery pieces does a brigade have? And so, you're going to take a battalion of paladins, 18, and they're suddenly going to be able to go up against 10,000 Russian artillery pieces? Now, we can make it 36 paladins if we bring in 2 brigades. That's 10,000 troops. Let's double it. Let's go to 72, 4 brigades. You can't go much beyond 4, ladies and gentlemen, because we don't have them. Okay, we don't have them. They can't be deployed. And 72 paladins ain't doing nothing. We gave the Ukrainians 120 plus M777s. Most of them are gone. We gave them a lot of M109s. They're gone. We gave them a lot of Caesars. They're gone. They're running out of stuff, guys, because this is a high-intensity conflict. We don't have the ability to sustain this, and the Pentagon knows this. So that's why I take umbrage with Tucker Carlson when he said there's going to be a hot war. No, Tucker, there isn't. There isn't. But here's the most dangerous thing Tucker says. He says, I can allow him to he was told something, so he's repeating
Right,
it.
yeah.
But the next thing he said, so therefore, we have to clean up the war powers authorities so that we can win this. And there's the danger. He's thinking that if we simply make Congress more efficient in freeing up war powers capability, that we can actually beat the Russians on the battlefield. Pro tip, Tucker, even if you did everything you wanted to do, you do know that our army hasn't trained to fight this kind of war. We don't know how to do it. We don't do core size level evolutions anymore, except on paper. This would now be reality. Tucker, we can't beat them. I'm just telling you straight up, Tucker, it ain't going to happen. And you were grossly irresponsible in insinuating that it could happen. What you should be saying, Tucker, is parroting what Clinton High Note said, which is there ain't a scenario out there where in a war game where we win against Russia. So therefore, rather than talking about the possibility of conflict, we should be doing everything possible to prevent that conflict. Now, if you want to prepare for that conflict, that's another thing. But then start preparing. Give us the money, give the military the money to go into the field and put 6 to 8 months a year training in the field, live fire, maneuver. That costs a lot of money. Get the manpower up so that we're not at 6,000 deficit by recruiting, and we have people who aren't eating pizza all the time, fat bodies who only know how to do Game Boys. We need real men who have been eating raw meat their entire life, who've been snarling while they're playing football on the ground, because that's what you need in combat, people. I'm not being sexist. I'm not being anything. I'm just stating the straight up fact. Look at Ukraine. Look at what's on the ground in Ukraine. These are real men. They're not muscle-bound special operators, but these are real men who are sleep-deprived, hungry, wet, cold, and you're not going to take some mama's boy out of the basement where he's been playing PC computer games and make him that. America needs to start recruiting the right people for the job we want them to do, or else we're not going to win the next one.
Well, the other part I think is this. Meanwhile, you got to have a broader perspective because BRICS is coming together. Africa, they're moving away, they're overthrown, they're throwing the French out. There's, you have an economic issue where even if we think about the issue of military, the economic flow of the world is moving in a direction where the dollar's going to crash, we ain't even going to be able to put a fire engine on the street in Schenectady. You know what I mean? The direction we're going, much less an F-35 somewhere else. We're moving to a point where we got fires in Hawaii, and they're like, yeah, we'll give these poor schleps, their kids burnt up, their whole town burned down. They get $700. Meanwhile, 25 billion goes to Lockheed, and that's just the money. You know, as we know, this is a money laundering operation. They're not even trying to build good weapons. They're not trying to build effective things. They're filling their filthy pockets. I don't even think we have a system now. It's so corrupt. I don't think we have the system now that if they wanted to, that they could effectively put that together, because they're so worried about misgendering a soldier. They're so worried about, making sure their father, their brother, or their son gets his fair share and his cut out of whatever money's going. Our system is so corrupt right now. I think we need to be focusing on trying to get this economy, trying to get, jobs, things for everyday people, because our country's, that's the other side. Our country's falling apart. You get the last word.
Well, I mean, you hit it on the head there. We don't have, for all the things you just said, we're not going to be able to build an effective military right now. I don't even know if we can turn it around. What we've done is the military can never be a mirror image of the society it defends, especially a progressive society. And I'm not coming down on a progressive society. This is the United States of America, land of the free, home of the brave. But the free people get to decide how they define themselves. So if we want to be a nation that's very diverse, very progressive, and all that kind of stuff, that's the nation we're going to be, because the will of the people says so. But the military that defends that nation can't be the military capable of defending that nation if it's also diverse and all this kind of stuff. The military has to be the most lethal fighting force on the planet. It has to be dedicated to one thing and one thing only, and that's closing with and destroying the enemy through firepower and maneuver. And you need a special kind of person to do that. And you can't pull that person out of a society that's not geared in that direction. We don't have a bunch of raw meat eating boys in a basement in Mississippi just waiting to be called up in time of war anymore. We have a nation that has gone in a different direction. We don't have, who hasn't done that? And again, I'm not saying that their way's better than our way, but the Russians are very consistent in saying we are traditional Christian family values with traditional home structures, and they do raise a bunch of meat-eating boys who, if necessary, can be brought up and mobilized. And not only that, their military has learned all the mistakes. They've learned all the mistakes. The rusty military that existed, the mobilization, all that rust has been kicked off. They've come in with the WD-40. They've greased up the joints. The Russian machine's working very well. They will be able to do the kind of war that Tucker Carlson wants America to prepare to do. We can't even recruit people today to join the military. And the people we do recruit, we have to give health waivers and psych waivers, and we have to give all these waivers for them to come in. We are in trouble, America. We are in deep, deep trouble. And you can't money will not solve this problem, because the one thing we've learned is that all money does, if it's not linked to very well thought out programs, is it leads to corruption. And the military complex is as corrupt as it gets today.
Yep. Well, thanks a lot, Scott Ritter. Certainly appreciate it. People are making comments. That we need a diverse fighting force. Here's what I think Scott and I mean. Look, I love football. NFL starts this week, right? And you play whoever, the Giants, right? My best friend played football, played professional football and college football, right? When we were I remember he was in college, he was benching 465. You can play against guys like that and say, okay, we have a diverse team. We have a woman of color. We have a transgendered person. We have a person who's has whatever, this kind of, and so you have all these diversities of people on there, right? When they run up against a guy benching 365, they are going to get hit so hard, they're going to end up on the screen. You know what I mean? They're going to wake up, if they're lucky, they'll wake up in a hospital a week later, right? So when it comes to a physical and kinetic conflict, the issue of diversity is not the issue. The issue is, can I put the best offensive linemen. My buddy used to talk about the defensive line. He said werewolves and people who can block werewolves. That's what you want on the defensive line. You can, we got a transgendered person of this, that, blah, 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 who's an offensive lineman. That defensive lineman's going to break that guy into 10 pieces. He's going to pick him up and use him as a projectile and throw him at the quarterback. That's what you're going to have. So what we're talking about is when it comes, I used to have a joke. People know I was in law enforcement. And when people would ask, we're going to do this or that, my joke would always be this: we're here to defend democracy, not practice it. Go do what you got to do, right? That's the game in the military. And that's all we're talking about. It's not like anti-everybody getting a fair shot. It's when it comes to somebody's invading your country, you better put the best group of people that you can on the ground to physically defend them. Because, but again, like we said, I'll end up by saying this: people aren't joining. One of the reasons, talk to young people, they're pissed about our foreign policy. They're pissed about what we're doing overseas. They don't feel as though they're going into the military to defend their country, to defend their values, to defend anything. They don't want to go around the world and make the world safe for some billionaire, for Bill Gates or whoever, some billionaire oligarch. And that's where we are now. But at any rate, Scott, everybody go to scottritterextra.com. That's scottritterextra.com. Don't forget, Scott does hard work. He needs people to, contribute. He's got to feed the family. He's got to eat. He's got to do all of those kinds of things. So when you go to scottritterextra.com, there are options there for you to donate and help keep the Scott Ritter train chugging along, saying, I think I can. I think I can. Scott Ritter, thanks a lot. And I'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Charlie.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. I got to make a run for it. I'm heading for Dunkin' Donuts. I'll tell you exactly where I'm going. I got to go to Dunkin' Donuts and get my coffee, and then I'm heading for the train station for DC. Hey, everybody likes different kind of coffee. I'm a Dunkin' Donuts man. I don't like Starbucks, Scott. Can't stand Starbucks. All right. Peace, guys. We're out.